Well, for more on the floods and its impact on the economy, we're joined by William Lee from Los Angeles. He's chief economist at the Milken Institute. Good to see you.
Hi.
So let's start by talking about where we're seeing the most immediate economic impact from the floods now and how that might change in the longer term.
The biggest threat is really to the outlook for inflation. These floods have been extraordinary this year. It's affected 27 provinces, affecting a population of over 38 million people. So this year has been incredibly unusual. And Shandong province, which has been heavily affected, is also known as China's vegetable capital. So we see food prices and hog prices go up tremendously this year. And inflation this year has gone up to almost 5% toward the beginning of this year. Now, fortunately, because these are floods, should cycle over fairly quickly, with the impact on inflation is a transitory blip, as it were, and we should see it come back down again later on this year as hog production, vegetable production, and a lot of the restoration is done. The big fear, of course, is whether or not the Three Gorges Dam and other permanent structures will be damaged by the flood, and that's something we have to watch out for.
And we did see food prices jump more than 10% just in June, partially due to the coronavirus pandemic. Do you expect inflation to further expand once you couple things like the recovery from the pandemic as well as the floods creating new challenges?
Well, the pandemic has shut economic activity down, which has caused a lot of supply to be restricted. So the restricted supply in the face of a reopening China is where we see the constraints causing inflation. I think one of the things that we also have to remember is that the COVID phenomenon has hit the world in general. So even though China has recovered on the supply side with industrial production bouncing back quite nicely, inventories are building up because a lot of the production cannot be sold abroad. And within China, people seem not to be seem to be very reticent about going out and spending in retail spaces because a lot of people feel it's really not healthy to be out spending and gathering in large places as they did before. So we see in the GDP numbers that consumption has been held back and retail sales has really been slow to recover, much slower than production has been.
So you mentioned retail sales. We also saw that some of China's PPE producers were also affected by the floods. Talk about sort of the trickle-down effect that comes with this combination of the pandemic recovery and also the floods for some of these other economic sectors.
Well, the key about the PPE production is that China has sort of gotten a bad reputation for producing poor quality exports of PPE materials. But I think within China, the stories have also gone out so that it causes more concern on the part of retail, the retail sales, because people are just afraid to go out, not knowing whether or not the PPE that they have is protective or not. But for China in general, we see that the recovery is ongoing. We see that retail sales are starting to come back on again. And the temporary spike in inflation caused by the pork shortage earlier this year has really eased up quite considerably. And we see that CPI inflation will likely come back to the 2% level in the second half of the year.
And as some of our viewers may be aware, pork prices are a key measure of inflation in China. And we did see that soaring even before the pandemic because of the swine fever. What's your outlook now?
Well, the African swine flu hit in late 2018, and that devastated the production of pigs in China. And I think all through 2019, especially in the second half of 2019, government policies were geared toward increasing supply, and that's really been quite successful. Even though at the beginning of this year, we still see pork prices go up considerably, especially around Chinese New Year's. Since then, we see pork prices come back down. And going forward, the increase in supply as well as the increase in imports in the United States, assuming that the Phase 1 deal stays intact, should do a lot to ease the shortage of pork. After all, pork is 75% of China's meat consumption and 50% of China's poultry and meat consumption. So pork is a very important component of the Chinese diet, and imports and domestic production should be coming on stream so that in the second half of the year there'll be plentiful supplies.
And we know that restaurant owners who were already suffering from the previous lockdowns were now finally sort of breathing a sigh of relief before now the floods. How is the situation for them, and what sort of support are they getting?
Fiscal policy has been geared toward trying to provide support for the small and medium-sized businesses. Well, unfortunately, a lot of the fiscal impulse has been absorbed in a way that doesn't further spending. Being cautious people, the Chinese have taken a lot of the tax rebates and a lot of the subsidies and pocketed and increased their savings. So we see that in the drop-off in retail sales, and that has not done well for a lot of these smaller businesses. It's going to depend a lot on the provincial and local policies to try to get the recovery going, getting the credit out and supporting these businesses, preventing them from going into bankruptcy. That's the key. China has to maintain its small business infrastructure, or else the recovery will be in jeopardy.
All right, well, thank you. Always good to have you. William Lee there, Chief Economist at the Milken Institute.